Hi, I'm Hillary Johnson, and welcome to Flashback, where we take a look at local stories from years gone by. Today we go way back to September 8th, 1988, where a unique style of plane graced the local airspace.
They are a rare bird, the Bristol freighter. If you've seen one fly in the northwest skies, you probably took a second look, just because the Bristol is such a unique craft. First of all, it's noisy. It's also big. It seems to lumber through the air, slowly and deliberately, just fast enough to remain airborne. And it's got a rather peculiar shape, a big bulbous nose, with the flight deck perched high on top, reminiscent of the Boeing 747 jumbo jets. The Bristol freighters were built in England in the early 1950s by the Bristol Corporation. 214 of the craft rolled off the assembly lines. Of those, only 2 or 3 are still in flying condition. One of them is here in the Northwest. It's owned by Trans-Provincial Airlines. The company needed a reliable, economical workhorse of a plane, and it found 2 of the Bristol freighters in New Zealand. That country's Air Force had been using the planes for some 25 years. Trans-Provincial also found Jerry Gaston in New Zealand. He knows the Bristols inside and out as well as anybody. Gaston was with the New Zealand Air Force, and for a quarter century has been flying and working on the planes all over the world, from the jungles of Vietnam to the highlands of Great Britain. But now he and the Bristol are in the Northwest, working for Trans-Provincial. Jerry flew the Bristol to Canada from down under, a trip almost as interesting as the plane itself.
We didn't have too many problems. We landed first in American Samoa, in Pango, and overnighted there, and then the next day we pressed on to Hawaii.
How long did that take?
That took us just under 16 hours from Pango to Hawaii, about 11 hours to Pango from Auckland in New Zealand. And then another 16, and then we left the next day for the west coast of the United States, and that took us 17 hours. So that was all. The last leg to Auckland there was at night, so there wasn't a lot to see, but it was encouraging to see the big jets 30,000 feet above us, so that at least we knew we were on the right track. You know.
And that's all hands-on time?
Yes, it was, yes. The total to get it to Canada, to Abbotsford, was just under 52 hours. So.
The Bristol is a heavy transport plane. Trans-Provincial needed such a craft to service a growing industry in the Northwest. The company is flying millions of kilos of equipment into mine sites that are being developed in a vast area northwest of Stewart. The 2 big doors on the plane's nose swing wide open, allowing easy access to the cavernous storage area. It's big enough to fit several vehicles in at once, not to mention all the other supplies and equipment needed to bring a mine into working production. Jerry says when it comes to moving heavy, oversized cargo over relatively short distances, there's not many planes that will stack up with the Bristol.
There is nothing that'll compete with them. If you've got to air freight it, then the Bristol freight is the way to air freight it on those short legs. Modern aeroplanes have tended to get too sophisticated. They've got retractable undercarriage and pressurisation and all the nice things, which are very nice to have, but they all cost money, whereas the Bristol was strictly a utility aeroplane. The basic airframe itself is, really an alloy box.
It's a working man's work plane.
Yes, it sure is, yeah, it is. It's got an effective payload of around 12,000 pounds for that 200 miles, and it does it very economically. The aircraft burns about 120 gallons of fuel an hour. Now, in that hour, you can travel 160 miles. So when you're looking at the sort of country that Canada's got, if you can transport something, that distance and that time for that fuel, you're well in. The modern aeroplanes, if there is an equivalent to the Bristol, which there really isn't, they can't come anywhere near that.
The Bristol cruises at 145 knots, and its comfortable ceiling is 10,000 feet. It's 96 feet long and carries a crew of 3. But the secret to its heavy payload capacity is in the wings. They're big, 108 feet in length and wide across. The large surface area provides plenty of lift to carry heavy loads. But to go along with lift, a plane also, of course, needs engines. The Bristol has two. They, like the plane, are big and unique.
Yes, it has. It's a sleeve valve engine. There are no other aircraft engine makers in the world that really went into sleeve valves. Years and years ago, Willys Knight made a car that was sleeve valve. Way back in the 30s, I think.
What's the good point about those engines, those types?
Well, Bristol Aeroplane or Bristol Engine Company, they really perfected the engine, and its specific fuel consumption. To put it a bit technically, that's its real. The amount of fuel that burns for the power it puts out, that's its real forte. If you have a look at the frontal area of it, which is important in an aircraft engine because of drag, you'll see that it's not much bigger than a lot of very much smaller engines. That particular engine's 2,000 horsepower.
Piloting a Bristol freighter can be a real challenge, as a trans-provincial pilot found out this past June. The company had two of the planes, but it lost one of them in a crash at a remote airstrip at a mine site near the Iskut River, north of Stewart. The plane was fully loaded, coming in for a landing, when a gust of wind caught it from the side. The pilot's been flying heavy planes in the rugged mountains of BC for over 20 years, but there was little he could do. The big Bristol spun around and careened off the runway. When it stopped, the plane was a write-off, almost ripped into two sections. The surviving Bristols, already vintage aircraft, suddenly became much rarer. Around the trans-provincial office, that day in June was a sad one, but nobody was pinning the blame on the pilot. As Jerry explains, the controls on a Bristol are sort of steam-driven, and the plane responds slowly. Pilots need a lot of anticipation, and if the winds are gusting, it can be extremely tricky.
If you're in real turbulence, you know, and the wing goes down and you wind a bit of aileron on to bring the wing back up, the wing sort of comes up after it's made up its mind it's going to come up. It doesn't come up when you think it should, like an ordinary aeroplane. Now, probably the hardest thing to do with a Bristol freighter is to land it nicely. I've seen pilots that have got thousands and thousands of hours on them, and they'll just kangaroo hop that thing down the runway, particularly if it's light. The wing is, you know, such an enormous wing on it that it'll just keep on keeping on. And these sort of winds that you're getting here, you know,
The lift on that wing.
yeah. And if you come in light over the fence and try and grease it on, you know, she'll just bounce its way down. Yeah. Frustrating and embarrassing, especially for the more experienced pilots, because, you know, it's a bit of pilot pride to try and land the thing nicely, but, you know, you'll do one brilliant landing one day and the next one will be an absolute disaster. You learn to live with it.
Jerry has learned to live with the Bristols. That's no problem. It's living without them that'll be difficult. At first, he came up here to the Northwest just for several months to teach the new crews the idiosyncrasies of flying and maintaining the Bristol freighters. Well, those few months stretched into a few more months, and Transprovincial realized getting the most value out of the planes without Jerry was not going to be easy. So Jerry's going to stay with his beloved Bristols for a while yet. He and his wife have moved into the country. They've even bought a house in Terrace. And so there's a pretty good chance that as long as the Bristols keep hauling heavy freight throughout the region, Jerry Gaston won't be far away, puttering with the plane, kicking a tire or twisting a wrench, doing what he does best. And when the day comes that he has to say goodbye, well, Jerry doesn't have much to say about that. Just it'll be another experience, albeit a sad one.